Hello, today I'm beginning with a thought about identity and how we perform our personhood, particularly in times where we are isolated or removed from our particular groups, the groups that give us meaning on a daily basis or even on a more extended cadence than this. For example, you see people once a week, once a month, even perhaps less frequently than this. I believe in these times in which we are more isolated than ever from our groups, from our usual social circles, and from our worlds, there is a particular struggle in remaining ourselves. I think there is a level of self that resides within you. You know this self. You remember what the self feels like. But in instances in which we see the outside world with a limited frequency, there are critical parts of ourselves that become dormant because we are not given the opportunity to perform them in space, to enact these parts of ourselves that usually come out when we see other people. And importantly, these parts of ourselves come out when we see other people that are not directly embedded in our daily lives. For example, if you are seeing your family or your partner or your roommates on a daily basis in your living space, it doesn't really count because you are not performing in the same way that you would be if you were walking on the street, or if you were going to work even, or if you were going to events and places where you will meet new people. Even if you are an introvert at your core, even if meeting new people is really not your favorite thing to do, I still think that there is a very key part of ourselves that is lost when we are not interacting with our regular groups of people on a regular basis too. And so I think we are in this place in which for many months now, for us especially here in the United States, we have not had the reason or the real mass of people that we would usually encounter. Even if you are going out to the grocery store, or maybe now you are dining outside, there is still a difference in the way that we are performing socially. For me at least, it feels as if people are looking less somehow. It feels, even as I begin to go out into the world again, that we are still retaining some core level of isolation. So this feeling of going out on the street and being dressed really beautifully or really in a very interesting way, this feels like it is still missing from me. But I think then it's important to talk about what happens in the absence of this kind of social interaction. On the one hand, I believe that in the early months, maybe even now, we have forgotten in a sense what it feels like to really dress and be out in social life, to be gregarious, to be outgoing, to be noticed even. I think these things are missing, and for me, and perhaps for you as well, I think there are two modes that come out of this. One is simply being mute, feeling like this energy does not exist in the world right now for us. But the other path is performing in a digital way. Whether you are performing on Instagram for your friends, or perhaps you are dating online and going on Zoom or video dates, the space of our performance has completely shifted. And this is not to say that we were not performing in these spaces before, we absolutely were. On Instagram, for sure, we are all performing to a certain extent there before this happened. But in many instances, we were performing on Instagram, we were performing our socializing on Instagram. So we were performing in a social way, and now we must continue our isolation in our performances. That is to say that on Instagram, because we are isolated, we carry out that isolation again in our digital performances. So while performing digitally might provide a small sense of relief, it might remind us of being in a group setting or being in a setting where we might pass people by that we know or don't know. It is not a complete solution. It is better than nothing, I think, for now. But it is incomplete because ultimately, as we all know, as we have been experiencing for years, social media does not replace socializing or social interaction, especially organic social interaction. It does not act as a proper replacement for this. So we are carrying our isolation forward with us in many spaces. Of course, because it permeates basically our whole lives as social creatures too. Like, this isolation is quite expansive. So for me, over the course of these past now 6 months, it has been a very strange experience as someone who is very aware of the performativity, and frankly, as someone who enjoys this performativity, this social performativity. It has been very strange because I feel, although I know who I am and what I enjoy, so much of what makes my life feel exciting and engaging is simply not available to me and to many of us right now. But I think that it is extremely important to continue in whatever way we can to pursue this intentional performance and creation of our identities. Because it feels as if we stop for a prolonged period of time, it's a little dramatic, but it feels like we die a little bit. And of course that's very unpleasant. And it's really something I think we all need to consciously work against. There was a point recently when I felt like clothes had absolutely no purpose or meaning other than to simply cover our bodies, keep us warm. It became an extremely utilitarian relationship that I had with clothing. And before this pandemic, before the quarantine, clothes for me were a window and a vehicle to experience things in a heightened way. So I think it's really indicative of the changes and the pressures of our current situation for me to simply say, but there's no purpose in clothing anymore. It is simply a daily habit to just put our clothes on, maybe for work or comfort, whatever. And it is kind of tragic to think that there is no joy in dressing anymore, or there was no joy in dressing anymore, because this, I think, is exactly related to this idea of a loss of this exterior self in which we are social, in which we connect with others. Because, as we all know, as I hope you know, clothes are a way to connect with people. When we wear an outfit, when we pick a new piece of clothing, we are articulating our vision of ourselves in relation to everybody else who's getting dressed in the world, in our society. Because clothes, the act of dressing, is a relational action. We self-identify, we self-categorize in relation to the people in our surroundings, in our vicinity. And this act every day of picking your clothes and how you wish to show your body or not show your body, every day we are making a statement reaffirming who we are or who we wish to be or who we wish not to be. And so over the course of many days, as we are inside with limited maybe capacity or limited reason to dress in a way that will be read by others. Every day that we do not do this is a day that we do not articulate our identity. And of course, over time, this articulation becomes farther and farther away until it would almost seem that clothes serve no purpose. Maybe even identity serves no purpose, because what purpose does identity have if we are not relating to others? So I think this is very dangerous. And I think even if you are not going to go outside, or even if you are not going to be able to see your group of people, or even see people you don't know, or even if they are not going to look at you, making dressing a priority in terms of articulation of identity is very important for us on a psychological level. Because as we, little by little, day by day, begin to forget or reject or not acknowledge our identity, multifaceted identities, and how we relate to the world, we become even more isolated from social structures, from cultural structures, to the point where it's like we are just something that exists with no relations. And this is extremely unsatisfying. Now, on the other hand, if you were to look at this period of time and think, well, I have had months of not seeing anyone, this is the perfect time for me to recast my self in whatever manner you choose, visually, stylistically. I think this also poses an interesting problem, because when we choose to change how we dress ourselves, how we perform our identities, we are looking for signals from others to indicate whether or not we've done it well, or whether or not we are accepted by the group. So if you decided that you wanted to start emulating or wanted to start associating with a particular group, more so now than before the quarantine began, it would be in some ways more difficult for you to find this acceptance. On the other hand, I think there is a good argument that perhaps now, because the only real way we have to integrate ourselves with a new group is digital tools, for example, Instagram or TikTok comes to mind, you could argue that perhaps superficially it is easier to insert yourself into a new scene, into a new group of people, because all you have to do is perform the surface level traits of this group to identify yourself as an acceptable member of the group. But you do not actually need to form deep connections with this group of people. Perhaps in the past it would be a different experience, in which we could imagine, for example, there is a social group on a college campus that is interested in, let's say, indie music, and they all dress, they all speak, they all move in a similar way. They have similar views, and they attend similar parties. And to really make a meaningful transition to this group on a college campus you would need more than the outfit. You would need the personal connections, you would need the socio-political views, you would need the taste, you would need to know where this group is congregating. But now, if you take to TikTok, for example, it is simply a question of algorithm for you to be placed in the correct group. So, if you are performing visually, if you are performing perhaps topically in terms of talking about or performing in relation to things that are important to this group, entry is much easier. So I do wonder, when we exit this time and when we are able to reconvene, what the process will be like for people who have during this time made a transition to a new group. Will they be able to, in social life, make connections with and seek out the group that they prefer? It's an interesting question. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So I suppose to wrap this up, what we have spoken about largely centers on the performance of identity and why that is important and why this time has made it particularly difficult. Of course, my focus has been largely on clothes and how we visually perform, but there is much more performance that exists beyond just the garments we choose and how we move through the world. And the second subtopic, I suppose, that we have discussed is making a change in one's identity, whether re-establishing your identity is now easier or harder, and what the particular struggles might be with that during this time and during other times. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts if you have them, so please share. And once again, thank you for listening to my thoughts. I hope you have enjoyed, or perhaps it has made you think about something in a new way. And I hope you have a good day. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my tea and get back to work.